I am witnessing a moment that has caught Washington's strategic establishment fundamentally off guard. For months, perhaps years, American policymakers operated under a set of assumptions about Russian capabilities, intentions, and strategic flexibility that have now been revealed as dangerously incomplete. The unexpected move from Moscow, whether a dramatic military redeployment, a sudden diplomatic breakthrough with a key regional power, an unprecedented technological demonstration, or a bold economic countermeasure, has forced the United States to confront an uncomfortable reality. Russia retains far more agency, creativity, and strategic depth than the prevailing Washington consensus acknowledged. As I analyze this development, I observe not merely a tactical surprise, but a systemic failure in American intelligence assessment, strategic forecasting, and geopolitical imagination. The question before us is not simply what Russia has done, but what this reveals about the deteriorating quality of American statecraft and the widening gap between Washington's perception of global power dynamics and the actual distribution of leverage across the international system. The shock in Washington stems from a cognitive dissonance that has been building throughout the post-Cold War era and intensified dramatically since 2022. American policy elites constructed a narrative in which Russia was fundamentally a declining power, demographically challenged, economically stagnant, technologically backward, diplomatically isolated, and militarily overextended. This narrative was not entirely false. Russia does face severe demographic constraints. Its economy remains heavily dependent on energy exports. Its technological base lags behind Western and Chinese capabilities in critical sectors. But the narrative became totalized, transforming from a nuanced assessment into an article of faith. Russia was assumed to be incapable of strategic surprise, locked into predictable patterns of behavior, and fundamentally reactive rather than proactive. Every Russian action was interpreted through this lens: desperate, irrational, the flailing of a dying empire. This interpretive framework blinded American analysts to the possibility that Moscow retained the capacity for calculated strategic maneuvers that could reshape regional or even global dynamics. I trace the origins of this blindness to structural problems within American strategic culture. The United States emerged from the Cold War with an overwhelming sense of ideological and material superiority. The Soviet collapse was interpreted not as the failure of a particular system under specific historical conditions, but as the inevitable triumph of liberal democracy and market capitalism. This teleological worldview made it difficult for American policymakers to imagine that a post-Soviet Russia shorn of communist ideology and reduced in territorial scope, could reconstitute itself as a serious geopolitical challenger. When Russia began reasserting itself under Putin in Chechnya, Georgia, Syria, and ultimately Ukraine, these actions were framed as anomalies, the death throes of an archaic imperialism rather than the calculated moves of a state adapting to a multipolar world. American intelligence agencies focused overwhelming resources on tactical assessments, troop movements, weapons inventories, economic indicators, while underinvesting in strategic analysis that could anticipate paradigm-shifting moves. The unexpected Russian move, whatever its specific form, exploits precisely this gap in American strategic imagination. If Russia has achieved a breakthrough in hypersonic weapons technology that neutralizes certain American defensive systems, it demonstrates that Moscow retained the capacity for asymmetric technological development despite sanctions and isolation. If Russia has secured a major diplomatic realignment with a key Middle Eastern or Asian power, it reveals that American assumptions about global isolation were premature and that much of the world remains open to pragmatic partnerships with Moscow. If Russia has implemented a financial countermeasure, perhaps a gold-backed settlement system for energy trades with major importers, it signals that alternatives to dollar dominance are not merely theoretical but operationally viable. If Russia has executed a military redeployment that fundamentally alters the strategic balance in Eastern Europe or the Caucasus, it shows that Western intelligence failed to detect or properly assess Russian capabilities and intentions. In each scenario, the common thread is the same. Washington's strategic framework was insufficient to anticipate or model Russian behavior accurately. I observe that the American response to this shock follows a predictable pattern, one I have seen repeated across multiple crises. The initial reaction is disbelief and denial. Officials question the intelligence, seek alternative explanations, and resist updating their prior assumptions. This phase is brief, but psychologically important. It reflects the cognitive investment American elites have made in their existing worldview. The second phase is threat inflation. Once the reality of the Russian move is accepted, it is immediately framed as an existential challenge requiring maximum response. Nuance is abandoned. The move is portrayed not as a calculated strategic action within a competitive international system, but as an unprecedented aggression that threatens the entire rules-based order. This rhetorical escalation serves domestic political purposes. It justifies increased defense spending, rallies allied support, and deflects criticism of prior intelligence failures, but it also forecloses the possibility of proportional, calibrated responses that might de-escalate tensions. The third phase, which I observe beginning now, involves bureaucratic scrambling to formulate a response. Interagency meetings proliferate, position papers circulate. Competing factions within the national security establishment advance their preferred solutions. Hawks advocate for aggressive countermeasures, expanded sanctions, increased military deployments, support for proxy forces. Moderates counsel caution, warning that overreaction could trigger dangerous escalation or alienate allies. Meanwhile, the intelligence community scrambles to explain how this surprise occurred, producing retrospective analyses that identify warning signs that were missed or misinterpreted. These post hoc explanations are valuable for institutional learning, but they do little to address the immediate strategic challenge. What concerns me most as I analyze this moment is not the specific Russian move itself, but what it reveals about the deteriorating capacity of the American national security apparatus to think strategically in a multipolar world. The United States continues to operate with Cold War-era frameworks, binary US versus them logic, alliance structures designed for a different era, intelligence priorities optimized for tactical rather than strategic surprise. These frameworks are increasingly inadequate for a world in which power is diffused across multiple centers, in which economic and technological competition is as important as military capability, and in which non-Western powers are developing alternative institutions and norms that challenge American-designed global architecture. Russia's unexpected move is a symptom of this deeper transformation, a signal that the unipolar moment has definitively ended and that American assumptions of dominance and predictability no longer hold. I turn now to the strategic implications of Russia's move, analyzing how it reshapes the balance of power across multiple domains. If the move is military in nature, perhaps the deployment of a weapons system that complicates NATO's defensive posture in Eastern Europe, the immediate impact is on deterrence calculations. European allies, particularly those on NATO's eastern flank, will demand increased American security commitments. Poland, the Baltic states, and Romania will seek additional troop deployments, air defense systems, and binding guarantees of Article 5 enforcement. This creates a dilemma for Washington. Escalating military presence in Eastern Europe risks provoking further Russian countermoves and increases the likelihood of miscalculation or accidental escalation. But failing to respond adequately risks undermining alliance credibility and emboldening Russia to test NATO's resolve further. The United States will likely opt for visible but measured reinforcements, rotating troop deployments, forward-positioned equipment, enhanced intelligence sharing, calibrated to reassure allies without crossing Russian red lines that could trigger direct confrontation. If the unexpected move is diplomatic, perhaps a formalization of security cooperation with China, Iran, or a major shift in relations with India or Turkey, the implications extend beyond any single region. A deeper Russia-China axis, formalized through joint military exercises, technology sharing, or coordinated economic policies, would fundamentally alter the global balance. It would force the United States to confront the possibility of simultaneous crises in Europe and the Indo-Pacific, stretching American military and diplomatic resources to their limits. It would accelerate the formation of a counter-hegemonic bloc explicitly designed to constrain American power. And it would provide both Moscow and Beijing with greater strategic depth and resilience against Western pressure. American policymakers have long feared this scenario, but their response options are limited. Attempting to drive a wedge between Russia and China through selective engagement has failed repeatedly. Threatening both simultaneously with maximum pressure risks pushing them closer together. The least bad option may be grudging acceptance that a Eurasian strategic partnership is now a permanent feature of the international landscape, requiring fundamental adjustments to American grand strategy. If Russia's move is economic, perhaps the successful launch of an alternative payment system that allows major oil and gas importers to bypass dollar-denominated transactions, the impact strikes at the heart of American global power. The dollar's reserve currency status is the foundation of American financial leverage, enabling Washington to impose sanctions, finance deficits, and project power at relatively low cost. Any viable alternative, even if initially limited in scope, threatens this privilege. Russia has been working for years to de-dollarize its trade relationships, promoting yuan, rupee, and ruble-denominated transactions. If Moscow has now operationalized a gold-backed or commodity-linked settlement mechanism that major importers find attractive, it demonstrates that alternatives to the dollar-dominated system are not only possible but practical. The immediate market impact may be modest. Global reserve currencies shift slowly, but the long-term trajectory would be clear. Reduced demand for dollars would raise American borrowing costs, constrain fiscal flexibility, and diminish Washington's ability to weaponize finance against adversaries. I observe that regardless of the specific nature of Russia's unexpected move, the strategic impact manifests across three critical dimensions: credibility, resources, and narrative. American credibility, the perception that Washington understands global dynamics, can anticipate threats, and responds effectively, takes a hit whenever a major adversary achieves strategic surprise. Allies begin to question American intelligence and strategic competence. Adversaries gain confidence that American power is more limited than Washington projects. Neutral states recalculate their alignment calculations, seeing opportunities to extract concessions from a United States suddenly uncertain of its dominance. Restoring credibility requires not just an effective response to the immediate challenge, but a broader demonstration that American strategy has adapted to new realities. The resource dimension is equally consequential. Every unexpected challenge forces the United States to divert attention, funding, and diplomatic capital from other priorities. If Washington must now concentrate on countering Russia's new capability or diplomatic breakthrough, it has less bandwidth for managing competition with China, addressing Middle Eastern instability, or investing in long-term challenges like climate change and technological competition. This is precisely the kind of strategic overextension that declining hegemons experience, pulled in multiple directions simultaneously, unable to concentrate force decisively, gradually exhausting finite resources across an expanding perimeter of commitments. Russia, operating from a position of regional rather than global ambition, can achieve strategic effects by forcing the United States to respond in multiple theaters, diluting American power even without matching it directly. The narrative dimension may be the most underestimated but ultimately most consequential. Great power competition is not merely a contest of military and economic capabilities, but a struggle over whose vision of international order appears more legitimate, more effective, more aligned with the future. For decades, the American narrative dominated democracy, free markets, rules-based order, multilateral institutions. This narrative is now contested by alternative visions: Chinese developmental authoritarianism, Russian civilizational sovereignty, various forms of non-aligned pragmatism across the global south. Russia's unexpected move, especially if it succeeds in achieving its objectives, reinforces the counter-narrative that American dominance is declining, that alternatives exist, and that states can pursue their interests outside or even against the American-led order without facing catastrophic consequences. This narrative shift is gradual and difficult to measure, but it fundamentally reshapes the international environment in ways that constrain American options over time. I examine the likely American response and find it constrained by both domestic politics and international realities. Domestically, the United States is deeply polarized, with little consensus on foreign policy priorities. A significant portion of the American public is skeptical of foreign entanglements and resistant to increased defense spending or military commitments. Congressional dysfunction makes it difficult to pass major legislation or sustain long-term strategic initiatives. The upcoming electoral cycle creates incentives for political leaders to prioritize short-term messaging over substantive policy. These factors limit Washington's ability to execute a coherent, sustained response to strategic surprises. Internationally, the United States faces an increasingly complex alliance landscape. European allies are divided on how to approach Russia, with Eastern Europeans favoring confrontation and Western Europeans seeking to preserve economic ties and avoid escalation. Asian allies are primarily focused on China, not Russia, and resist being drawn into European security disputes. Middle Eastern partners pursue their own interests, often in tension with American preferences. This fragmentation means that even when Washington formulates a clear strategic response, implementing it requires extensive diplomatic negotiation and compromise that dilutes effectiveness. The optimal American response would involve several elements that I see little evidence of emerging in current policy debates. First, a fundamental reassessment of strategic assumptions about Russian capabilities, intentions, and the sustainability of pressure campaigns. If Russia retains the capacity for strategic surprise after years of maximum sanctions and isolation, the premise that pressure will eventually force capitulation or regime change needs to be abandoned. Second, a shift from binary confrontation to competitive coexistence, recognizing that Russia will remain a significant power with legitimate security interests that must be addressed through negotiation rather than ignored through diktat. Third, a renewed emphasis on alliance cohesion through burden sharing and genuine consultation rather than unilateral decision-making, followed by demands for allied compliance. Fourth, investment in strategic intelligence and forecasting capabilities that can anticipate paradigm shifts rather than merely tracking incremental changes. I see little indication that Washington is prepared to undertake this kind of strategic reset. Instead, the likely response will be incremental and reactive, modest increases in military deployments, additional sanctions targeting specific sectors, rhetorical escalation paired with behind-the-scenes efforts to prevent direct confrontation, and continued hope that internal pressures will eventually destabilize Russia. This approach may succeed in managing the immediate crisis, but it does not address the underlying trajectory of American relative decline and Russian strategic adaptation. The gap between American ambitions and American capabilities continues to widen, and unexpected moves from adversaries will become more frequent, not less, as multipolarity deepens. I conclude by framing this episode within the broader arc of American grand strategy. The United States emerged from the Cold War with unprecedented power and equally unprecedented ambitions to spread democracy globally, to integrate the world economy under American-designed rules, to maintain military dominance in every region, to preserve the dollar's central role in global finance. These ambitions were always beyond America's sustainable capacity, but for 2 decades they seemed achievable because no peer competitor existed. That era has ended. Russia,